okay, let's assume that the government, a state actor, right, has taken away, right, your life, liberty, or property. Again, we're talking Fifth Amendment for feds and 14th for states. So if you have something in the fact pattern that has nothing to do with at-will public employment or merely harm to reputation, right? Again, those are your fact patterns where you're being tested on that stuff. If you get past that, we have a state and we have a deprivation of life, liberty, or property, then you're entitled to due process. And then the question is what? What does that mean, right? So we're going to talk about the three elements now of due process. So you know how that works, right? This is helpful. The courts have said if we conclude that you're entitled to due process, that means that you get the following three things. We mean all of them, and you know how that works, right? When the court says you need all of these, that means that means elements. So these are pretty common sense. I think this is one of those areas of law where if you'd let our class just sit around and talk about it for a little while, we would have come up with some of the same rules and principles. Number one, you're entitled to notice. Okay, that's the first element of procedural due process is notice. Notice has two components to it. There are two separate types of notice to which you're entitled. One is notice of what the rules are, right? That's why in criminal law, crimes have to be codified, right? You can't accuse somebody of a crime that isn't written down in a statute book, right, or an ordinance book as being a crime, right? You can't make crimes up as you go along. Why? Because you're entitled to notice, right? Can't charge me with doing something illegal if there was no way for me to know that what I was doing was illegal. So you're entitled to that notice. You're also entitled to notice that you've been accused of something, right? So see the difference. Number one, I'm entitled to know what the rules are, and number two, I'm entitled to know, right, that I've been accused of breaking the rules, right, so that I can defend myself. So when you think about that, the no parking sign, right, that's notice. The no parking sign on the side of the road is my notice, right, that there is no parking there, right, of what the rule is, right, and the ticket under my windshield is the second kind of notice, right, the notice of that I've been accused of a violation, right, notice of violation. I was recently cited. I don't know if I've told you about this. It was the bane of my existence for a while. I had a leaning fence on my property, and some city inspector came along, right? Okay, so there's a local ordinance that says you can't have a leaning fence, right, in Tampa, so that's my notice, right? We're on constructive notice, by the way, right, to know the ordinances and statutes in the jurisdictions where we live, or where we are. And so that the ordinance was my notice, right, that I'm not supposed to have a leaning fence, and the notice that was taped to my front door was my notice of violation. So, and it actually says that on it, right, notice of violation. You can't, right, because there's a fine associated with that, right? If I didn't fix it, right, they would have fixed it for me and fined me and all that. Well, that's taking away my money, which is clearly property, right? So I'm entitled to notice before they do that. All right, so that's notice. You're also entitled to a hearing. That's the second element of due process, right? You get notice and you get a hearing. Now, one of the things that I was talking about this morning on a radio show was what does that mean? Because there's a lot of question now about the Supreme Court, right? It has postponed oral argument in some cases. There's a possibility that they could cancel oral argument, right? And that they could decide the case on the papers, is how lawyers put it, right? Without oral argument. So the question has come up, is oral argument, right, required as part of your hearing? And the answer is no. So let me explain what hearing means. Hearing means an opportunity to be heard. That's all it means. Now, today we're talking about, or in this video rather, we're talking about the three basic elements of due process, right? If any of these elements is missing, then there's been a due process violation. What we're not talking about, because what we'll talk about in another video, is how much due process do you get, right? You get notice. How much notice, what kind of notice is a different question, but you're entitled to notice, right, under due process. You're entitled to a hearing. What kind of a hearing, when, how much of a hearing, right? That's a different question, but you are entitled to a hearing. The definition of hearing is opportunity to be heard. So technically, right, if there's something minor like a parking ticket, right, what it might say on the front, it might say, you're accused of parking here. If you got some kind of story you want to tell us, turn over the ticket, right? Write your side of the story, right, or your denial on that side of the ticket and send it in. And I would ask you, is that a hearing? And a lot of people would say, no, that's not a hearing, and you'd be wrong, right? Because if I was given the opportunity to turn over the ticket and write down my side of the story or to deny the accusation, right, that was a hearing. That was an opportunity to be heard. Again, don't confuse this with the question whether it was enough of a hearing, right? The first question is, was it a hearing? Right? Did you get a hearing at all, right? So if you get notice, right, if you had notice of the rule, even if it's constructive notice, if you have notice of violation, right, then notice, right, then you got notice. Whether you got enough is another story. If you had a chance to tell your side of the story, right, at all, then you got a hearing. Whether it was enough is a different question. Finally, you're entitled to an impartial decision maker. That's element 3 of under procedural due process, right? Impartial decision maker means somebody who's determining your fate, who has no stake in the outcome, no bias or prejudice against you, right? I want to tell you a brief war story on this. I saw when I was in Michigan, I won't get too much into any involvement, you know, that I had in this, but a case where a school district was trying to expel a student, as I mentioned in the last video, if a public school district wants to expel a student or suspend a student for more than 10 days, by the way, this is something I'll talk about more later, but the student is entitled to due process because a public education is a statutory entitlement, right? And a statutory entitlement like that is a property interest. Courts have no problem with that. So there was a hearing provided for the student, and the person presiding over the hearing worked for a law firm, right, that represented the school district. So the law firm that represented the school district was offered, right, as one of its services that it would provide a hearing officer, right, to preside over the hearing where the student's fate was being decided. And this blew up in the school district's face because the attorney for the student pointed out at the beginning of the hearing that the student, as a matter of procedural due process, is entitled to notice, a hearing, and an impartial decision maker, number 3, and an attorney who's working for the law firm that represents the school district, which in turn is advocating, right, for expelling the student, is not an impartial decision maker. So you rarely see a case where that third element, right, impartial decision maker, is at issue, but it can happen, and it did happen in that case. So those are the 3 elements of procedural due process. You're entitled to notice, you're entitled to a hearing, you're entitled to an impartial decision maker. What kind of notice, what kind of hearing, how much and when? We'll talk about that next. But those are your basic elements of procedural due process. If one of those is missing, there's been a due process violation, assuming you were entitled to due process. So hang in there, we'll get to another video in a little bit.